On to the Seattle Seahawks, where they're at 8.5. A little more optimism in Seattle. What does the best case scenario look like for the Seahawks?
Geno staying at the level he was last year, I guess, or at least the level he was earlier in the year. The young players that they had last year and that they've assembled this year, hitting the ground running or continuing, their impressive starts. Tariq Woolen developing, Devin Witherspoon looking like the best corner in the draft. Like just the general, like you said, the youth movement continuing to actually pay dividends for the Seahawks, in addition to Geno Smith continuing to look like the guy at quarterback, as unexpected as that was last year.
Yeah, and it's Geno Smith, who we've talked about on the mid-tier-ish quarterback contract, allowing for the rest of the roster to be better, to have the investment in DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, to have Jackson Smith and Jigba as this good, solid number 3 as a rookie, or D. Estridge, but just having that wide receiver 3 step up for Geno Smith. And yeah, you mentioned Devin Witherspoon, just all of the youth from last year's draft class continuing their development. Seattle's tough, and Bobby Wagner, who could still play, coming in to solidify linebacker. There's a lot of things to maybe be positive about Seattle. In the AFC, we kept talking about teams, maybe they can get to the AFC Championship, but there's so many of them. Can Seattle get to the NFC Championship, where it looks like it's the Eagles and the Niners, but there's a fine line there in the NFC. It's not as competitive as the AFC. Can Seattle get to the NFC Championship and beyond if all those things go right?
Yeah, I mean, if you assume, like the AFC, there's so many good teams, you're going to have to run a gauntlet to get anywhere in the playoffs. Whereas in the NFC, if we assume that we're expecting effectively a rematch of the NFC Championship game, 49ers Eagles again, for somebody else to get there, all they need is to win, one game against a really good opponent. And you don't even necessarily need that if somebody else knocks that guy, knocks that team off for you. Like if Washington somehow shocks the Eagles in the first round of the playoffs, then your pathway could be clear to play the Niners in the NFC Championship game. So who knows? But it's possible. I think for Seattle, making them and looking good, even looking better than a year ago, is probably the most optimistic scenario. I guess that probably, you could throw an NFC Championship game appearance in there, but to me that's almost that would be looking too much at the results rather than the sort of the outcome, the process, because they're not going to be better, I don't think, than the Eagles and the Niners, right? So they can still get to the title game, but that's kind of besides the point, because the sort of the mark to clear is actually being better than those two teams, which is not, I don't think, a realistic outcome.
So it's just being back on the right track. Geno Smith still being good, justifying the investment in him as the guy over the next couple of years. Worst case scenario, though, basically Geno turns back into a pumpkin.
Yeah.
More specifically, really he was number 2 in the NFL in turnover-worthy plays. I think he only had 9 official interceptions during the regular season, so the touchdown to interception ratio looks incredible. So very specifically, if Geno, who, again, so impressed with what he did last season, a few very elite games, if the lack of consistency comes back to bite, or the turnover luck, right? If he had a lot of issues throwing the ball into harm's way, in the end zone in particular, if a lot of those things come back to bite this year, then we might be talking about Seattle picking back in the top 10. I think that's also a realistic outcome, despite all the optimism coming out of Seattle from last season.
Yeah, I mean, he looked a lot worse down the stretch, but so did the offensive line.
Yeah.
It's difficult to know where the blame landed there. The biggest problem is Geno going back to that level, though. The offensive line being bad would be an issue, but you could work around it. If it's actually this is Geno who just reverted back to Geno, you can get away from it, but that's clearly a lot worse for Seattle because they thought they found a quarterback.